Alright, so for your watercolor tutorial, I just want to kind of start off explaining the watercolor part of this project a little bit. Number one, this part of the project is 100% optional. Obviously, with people doing these projects from home, as e-learners, I cannot require anybody to have watercolors or watercolor paints or paintbrushes or anything like that. So for the project, really the only thing that you need to do is to follow the instructions up until this point. Make sure that you finish the project nice and neatly with the pens. But the watercolor can be a nice touch, as you've probably seen in some of the student samples. So this is one of the samples that I've done in the past. And it just kind of obviously adds some color, and it makes the project nice and interesting and kind of complete. So without the watercolor, the project is completely fine. You could just submit that for your grade. I will grade you only on your ability to use the pen, and I will not grade anything based on the watercolor, whether you did it or not. So just a little bit about watercolor. Watercolor is a type of paint. The three main types of paint are oil paint, acrylic paint, and watercolor paint. Acrylic paint and watercolor paint are actually water-based, which means that you can mix water with the paints to dilute them and to make them spread easier. Oil paint is quite the opposite. So with oil paint, you cannot add water, because if you add water to oil, they resist each other. So it just doesn't quite work out that way. So you have to actually buy specific mediums, which is like a material, it's almost like a gel type. It's like a clear gel, and it's mixed with oil. And that's how you would mix oil paints together. But anyway, we're not going to be using oil paint. Number one, they're pretty expensive, and number two, they're very hard to control, and they take a long time to dry. So watercolor paints, the nice thing about watercolor is they're pretty relatively easy to use. Some of you may have learned how to use these in like elementary school, but they can also be very advanced depending on how you use them. So I'm going to go ahead and set my watercolors off to the side, and this is just a standard typical watercolor set. I'm not really too picky on what type of watercolor you get. I could actually throw a link into the week at a glance, which I'll go ahead and do that after this video. So I will put a link in there. If you're somebody that's interested in getting your own set of watercolor paints, you can do that. Like I said, with the oil paints, some tend to run very expensive and some tend to run pretty cheap. So obviously the more expensive, you're going to get a higher quality paint, and the cheaper it is, the colors might look a little bit off or diluted, and so just keep that in mind. Okay, so the first thing with watercolor paints, and we do have some of these in class for the people that are in class learning. I will be able to let you borrow some of these, but even if you are in class, this part is optional. So what I wanted to talk about first is basically how to use watercolors. Okay, so we're not going to get into this just yet. So the first thing you're going to need, obviously you're going to need your paints, you're going to need a paper towel, and you're also going to need a half a cup of water. Okay, I said half a cup because if some of you like to fill it up to the very top, and when you go to clean your brush, all that's going to happen is the water is going to spill all over the place. So with watercolor paints, right now the watercolor paints, they're hard and they're opaque. Okay, so opaque and transparency, you've probably heard those terms before. Opaque means that you cannot see through the color. Transparency means that you can see through the color. Now, how much transparency, okay, I should put that word on here, transparency. How much transparency there is all dependent on how much water you put into your watercolor paint. So you could have 0%, which is, opaque, or you could also have 100% transparent, which would be, put that on the wrong side. You could have 100% transparency, which would be water. Okay, and clean water specifically. So everything in between is going to be how much paint you have versus how much water. Okay, so here's how this works. What you have to do first is you're going to dip the bristles of your brush into the water. You're going to swirl it around gently into whatever designated color you're going for. Okay, in this case I'll use green. And if I just get my water a little bit wet, wow, that made sense. If I just get my brush a little bit wet and I go to paint, I will get a nice solid color. Okay, pretty cool. Every time you switch colors, you need to completely clean off your brush. Okay, I like to just wipe it on the edge. Okay, just like that. Dip it in a little bit of water, and then I'm going to go get another color, swirl it around. Sorry, I realized you couldn't see that. Swirl it around, and you're going to get a nice color. Okay, pretty opaque. Not very much water in there, so it's not very transparent. I would say the percentage would probably be around, like, I don't know, 5 to 10% for this. Okay, so now if I clean off the brush, there's a couple things I can do. Number one, if I want to make my color lighter, it's going to create a tint. Okay, so this causes a little bit of confusion because some people think of tinted windows. Well, tints actually mean that you're making the watercolor lighter. Okay, so you're either adding white, or in our case, we're adding water, and the water makes it more transparent. Okay, so why does the watercolor paint show up lighter if we're just adding water? Well, the reason that is because the paper that we're using is white. So if we're allowing the paper to show through, it's going to make the watercolor lighter. Does that make sense? So here's how this works. I'm going to take this green again. I'm going to get my brush just a little bit wet. Sometimes you got to get the brush wet to just kind of loosen up the paint. And I'm going to start a little mixture off into my mixing palette, which is usually the top of your watercolor tray. Okay? Now, if I start adding water, okay, so I'm going to clean my brush, take the water that's in my brush, I'm going to start mixing more. I'm going to clean my brush, take the water that's in it, mix more, and I'm going to repeat this process to get a lighter and lighter tint of the color green. Okay, so that's how you create a tint. Now, let me go ahead and grab some more green. We'll kind of start this process over. If I want to make green darker, the best way to do that is to add red. Okay, and why would you add red? Because if you look at a color wheel, in order to make colors darker, you would need to add the opposite color on the color wheel. So opposite colors, they're called complementary colors. Green and red are complementary colors. Blue and orange are complementary colors, and violet and yellow are complementary colors. Okay, so what I'm going to do, clean my brush off, and every once in a while you kind of need to go empty out your cup and refill it, because sometimes that contaminated mixture of water can affect the colors that you're using. So I'm going to take a little bit of red and I'm going to mix it in the green. Okay, now you want to make sure that you have a lot of color, okay, a lot of watercolor going on over here, because you probably noticed that showed up a little water. Okay, then I would technically need to clean my brush because I don't want too much color contamination. Okay, I added a little too much there. I'm going to get a darker shade, add a little bit of red, get a darker shade, add a little bit of red, and I'm going to get something that is pretty close to almost like a black or like a really dirty dark gray. But here's what's going to happen. Eventually, I'm going to get a shade of red, okay, which would probably be down in here somewhere. And if I continue to add red, I'm actually going to get closer to this right here. Okay, so green and red are complementary. Now, when you get to this point right here, where it starts to turn towards the other color, that's called the color's neutral. Oops, can't spell. Alright, so then obviously I would clean this up, take just red, add a little water. Okay, you see, notice there's a little contamination there from the water. So there's a little bit of green, so it's not going to show up as bright. So I would need to clean this thoroughly. Sometimes you actually need to clean out your entire watercolor section. So take your paper towel and just kind of dab it in the watercolor. Make sure your brush is super clean. There's still a little bit of green in here, but I'll try to get what I was trying to accomplish here. Add a little water. Add a little more water. And eventually you're going to get something very light. Okay? So tints and shades. Now that is going to be the only thing you need to focus on for the project. Okay. So let me get this off to the side for a second. Let me move this demo out of the way. And so when you go to apply this to your project, what you're going to do is I would pick one solid color for your architecture. In this case I chose purple or violet. And you're going to look at your architecture and you're going to think about tints and shades. Now, one little tricky thing. If you look really close, it's kind of a mistake that I made. If you make your watercolor too thick, you're actually going to cover some of your pen, it's called pensmanship, but you're going to cover some of your pen. So you want to keep the water color, paint, relatively diluted. So you want to use a little bit more water than normal, but you can still accomplish the different lights and darks. Okay, depending on how you mix complementary colors and how much water you add to your singular color. So if I'm choosing purple, okay, the color that I would add to make it darker would be yellow. Sometimes yellow and purple have a difficulty time mixing depending on the watercolor, so the second option is to always add a little bit of black. Just remember that black is very dominant, and so it's going to take over your painting really quickly, and it's going to take over your colors even faster. Then what you're going to do is once you kind of apply the watercolor to the lights and darks areas of your architecture, you are going to try to do what's called selective mark making. And it's in this case it's actually selective painting. So I didn't quite finish my not even close, but I didn't get to the rest of my architecture. This is the one that I actually finished. This is just my demo piece here. So for your background, one cool thing that you can do with the watercolor is you can take your color. Let's say you want to do purple. And by the way, it's always good to clean out your mixing section, okay, at the end of each time you use it. What you can do is you can take a little bit of water, you can take whatever color you want the background, kind of water it down really nice, and you can paint right up to the edge of your building. And then what I like to do, and I think this is kind of a cool effect, you notice that the paint's getting lighter as I go down. Well, that's because I'm slowly losing paint in the brush, so you'll notice a little gradation there. So what you can do is you can put this on maybe a little bit thicker than I did here. And it's called selective painting. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to let this painting and all this paint, okay, just fade out into your background. And if you think about it, it's kind of like the use of gesture with a pen. And I just think it's a cool effect. So what I like to do is kind of create this really kind of organic, almost like a hazy effect. Okay, and you can keep this really kind of gesture-like, except just with a brush. All right, and I'm just going to let this kind of fade and run, let this watercolor run into my background. And it just creates this really cool, interesting effect with the watercolor. I personally like it. If you're somebody that doesn't like it and you want to try something else, you're more than welcome. I would probably run it by me first, but you can go for it. So I'm just going to kind of make this a nice little subtle and just let it fade off. I don't need to go all the way to the edge. I kind of like the way it looks right here with this really cool natural kind of water just flowing out into the background. Okay, so I'm going to leave it something like that. And if you take a look, if you remember from the pen demonstration, I told you can leave some of this pen just kind of fading off. Well, you can do the same thing with the watercolor and just create these really cool, loose, expressive brush strokes. Do the same thing for the background. Could look something like this, could look something like this. But really this part is up to you. I personally think watercolor is really cool if you leave it natural and leave it more expressive, like like in here. Okay, obviously you can be very detail oriented with a watercolor. You can be very realistic and specific, but I think this will be a pretty cool effect for this project. If you're somebody that's doing like a skeleton, I know a couple people in person are actually doing the skeleton instead of the architecture. This is the same thing applies for the skeleton. I can talk to you in class about that. And it just creates a really cool organic effect, especially when we're talking about two very contrasting ideas with an organic background, which is very natural and free-flowing, versus the architecture, which is very structured and man-made and very geometric. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions about watercolor specifically, feel free to email me, but just remember, tints and shades are going to help you in the long run when it comes to applying it to your building. All right, good luck, and I can't wait to see them.